All right, so now we're going to get into reunification post-Cold War. What has happened to the German economy since East and West Germany came back together? So at the time of reunification, like Anthony just said, East Germany was doing way worse than West Germany, okay? Their GDP per capita was about 40% of that of West Germany's, and its productivity was 30%.
Oh, God.
Okay. Yeah, they were looking terrible. The planned economy did not go well. I told Anthony a kind of a funny quote was at the beginning when the two Germanys split, one of the finance ministers in East Germany said something about like, now we'll see whether a planned economy or a privatized, decentralized economy will be better. We'll have a direct comparison to make. And he says something like, of course, the planned economy using all of the mental acuity and power of people will be more effective. And by the end of the Cold War, that's so clearly not the case.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So what happened after reunification? This is super interesting to me. First of all, East Germany was in a very bad place. Part of the reason they initially built a barrier between East and West Germany and restricted immigration is because the living standards in West Germany were so much higher. So it would make a ton of sense for all of the East Germans to want to cross that border and reach the prosperity of the West on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So once the barrier falls and movement is free between each side, instantly a ton of migration starts to happen out of East Germany into West Germany. Obviously, this hurts the economy. And the government knows that the East Germans are going to be way worse off than West Germans. Meanwhile, they have a specific policy that says that there should be some manner of equality amongst Germans, at least equality of opportunity. And so when the West German government, which is of course who takes over the reunited Germany, when they decide what kind of policies they're going to implement, their main priority is social good, social wellness. Okay. And there are some arguments that hurt the total German economy. The first item of business was figuring out currencies. So just like we talked about a currency change after World War II in West Germany, the West Germans had the Deutschmark, which was a strong currency, while the East had the weak Ostmark. Financial actors like banks wanted Ostmark holdings, the East German currency, to be transferred at a rate of 2-to-1 with the Deutschmark in order to protect the strength of the Deutschmark. Because if there was a 1-to-1 transfer, they thought that there would be too many Deutschmarks in the economy and the value would be driven down. But politicians who wanted social cohesion pushed hard for that 1-to-1 transfer because, God, the protests that they got even when they were floating the idea of the 2-to-1 transfer were enormous. They would kind of create these two different economic classes of citizens.
Well, think about those East Germans, right? Their purchasing power is cut in half in a second.
Yeah, exactly. Just like we talked about with Argentina, right?
Yeah, exactly the same thing.
So they decide mostly to do the 1-to-1 transfer. 1-to-1 conversion for cash and savings accounts. But there was a 2-to-1 conversion for corporate debts and housing loans, which makes sense, right?
Yeah,
because it's like we need to cut down the loans that are burdening the East German people. So across the board, they go for the social cohesion solution there. Meanwhile, the government immediately looked to privatize East German companies. So this is a super interesting, like, historical moment where a liberalized economy takes over a nationalized one. And It's like, what are we going to do with all of these government-owned assets? They created a government institution to handle what they were going to do with all of this land and these East German companies. And the solution really wasn't going to be pretty. There was no way to make it great. A lot of these East German companies just were... There were no way they were going to be viable in the free market, right? So and West Germany really quite urgently wants to have them integrated into the free market. They don't want to have to hold up these skeleton companies. So what happened was about a third of East German companies were deemed unviable and they were liquidated. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So the result of that, of course, is a spike of unemployment because all those companies that were just liquidated, all of those workers are now out of a job. And as a matter of fact, even more than a third of the East German companies were unviable, but the government let private investors try, again, in an attempt to prioritize social good in the East, to have unemployment not so low. And even then, it still did get so low. And of course, even though one of the reasons the East Germans couldn't compete is because now they have to compete with the West Germans, who have been competing in the free market for so long, and have gotten a quality of life, a GDP per capita, and productivity that's way, way higher than the East Germans. So where am I here? Goodness gracious. So after the East Germans have some of their companies liquidated, there's a moment right at unification where there's going to be wage negotiations basically for the East German workers who had just been paid by the government with their employers, with their new employers. How this system was set up is, again, it's very unique to the moment, where the employers that they are talking to were also just government employees just a year ago, right? And so now their employers are probably on the brink of losing their jobs themselves because these companies are going to be taken over by West German actors. And because of that, they're going to go on unemployment insurance from the government, which is based on their own wages, which are also going to be determined by the negotiations that they're doing. So you have two sides negotiating that are both incentivized just to raise wages as high as is kind of reasonable.
Sure.
Okay? So instantly we see a spike in East German wages. And that ends up being bad because we talk about how we want union wages to rise, how we cheer on the UAW when they get their raises. The problem is the East Germans, again, are only 30% as productive as the West Germans. And so now you have these really expensive workers making these goods that no one wants and having a market in East Germany even that is open to Western goods, which are way better and which are made by labor that is priced the same, if not less, than the East German labor. So you basically have these East German workers who are making nothing of value to anyone. Okay? The high labor costs kick in, the unprecedented levels of competition kick in, and East German output, because of this, falls 2/3 after the first year of reunification. Total German output falls 1/3 after the first year. Okay?
How did they measure that 1/3 fall?
I think it's like it's industrial output.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
that's something.
It's monetary, I believe.
Okay, but that's something. So you're saying, and a lot of that falling is obviously in East Germany. I'm sure West Germany wasn't really the ones falling that much, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's I don't think West Germany was falling at all.
Right.
I think having access to the East German market actually boosted them
because that's just, now they're just shipping all their products over there.
Exactly. Yeah, and they can't be competed with at all.
Yep.
So it's really bad in the short run, especially for the East, and because the East is now integrated for the country as a whole. Then you have the economy growing. You do have the economy growing overall, and it does bleed into East Germany because you can have movement between the two sides, right? So it does make it so that East German GDP per capita was up to 50% of West Germany's by 1994, which was 4 years after reunification. They reunified in October of 1990, but unemployment was still 14%, and high unemployment persisted throughout the decade. part of this was, even though the GDP per capita was rising and the GDP overall of East Germany was rising, the previously planned economy was not set up to absorb the unemployed part of the population. Like you talked about with the idea of the SPD to maximize employment, that was the same idea in East Germany. And so it didn't have a nimble, agile entrepreneurship scene to be able to innovate and create new companies in the case of high levels of unemployment. Now, East Germany's growth in this time was largely buoyed by transfers from the West, which was over 770 billion Deutschmarks up through 1994. And at first, the West German government said that they weren't going to tax at all, that they were just going to fund the East Germans with debt, but very quickly that turned out to not be sufficient. So it has been funded by a 5.5% tax, the reunification has, which actually lasted until 2021.
No way.
Yeah, so that's on top of their income taxes and everything else. 5.5%. And in this time, East Germany was a boat anchor weighing down the potential of West Germany's export economy. Because even though the Deutschmark was somewhat devalued, which should have made Germany a bigger exporter in the 90s, the East was running a trade deficit equivalent to 50% of East German GDP.
Oh, God.
Yeah, which was wild. So where do we go from here? This is what's happening in the 90s. And then in the early 2000s, they're kind of starting to come out of it. Reunification is going a little bit better. Unemployment has dropped a little bit, but growth is still weak because these problems have persisted. Then in 2002, Germany converts to the euro. And all of a sudden, its currency is undervalued compared to its economic output despite the East Germans. Of course, East German productivity has also been increasing in the years since reunification. So this led to several years of large increases in exports, particularly to China, which was growing rapidly. China's been growing at least 6% every year up to 2018 and as high as 15%. It also implemented labor market flexibility policies intended to devalue labor, including reducing pensions, cutting medical benefits, and reducing Social Security.
What year was this?
This is early 2000s, 2002
Okay.
about.
So I have a chart outlining the exports of Germany to China, and around starting at 2002, it starts increasing, doubling every 2 years.
Yes, exactly. They relied on that growth so heavily. And so since they devalued their labor, again, the goods were made cheaper. It was easier to export. And they placed a ton of this emphasis on maintaining international price competitiveness. Of course, this means that they're naturally investing in manufacturing, even though they're growing and soon to be one of the world's leading economies, which we've talked about before, generally transition to services. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of an incongruence that I'm going to get back to a little bit later. The focus on exports had a real negative effect on people in the bottom half of the German income spectrum, where real wages for the bottom 40% of the income distribution have dropped over the past 20 years, right? So you saw income inequality grow and grow and grow from the idea that you need to keep your exports competitive, you need to keep labor costs low.
The real gross domestic, when I'm looking at disposable income for Germans,
yeah,
right, it kind of flatlines around 2002 for a while.
Yes, exactly. And this is why. And the problem with that is, even though Germany was seen to be strong for about the past, 15 to 20, about 15 years, really in Germany struggled until this export strategy got them out
in
around 2005, 2006.
2005 is when wages started increasing again, or they had more disposable income.
Okay. But then it's flatlines again a little bit,
yes,
right?
then flatlines again.
Yeah. So they take advantage of the China factor, but the problem is this hurts their private consumption massively. Because when you don't have disposable income, you don't buy things. They also didn't have a social safety net because that was part of pressuring wages downwards. And private consumption is the backbone of any strong economy. Even in the German economy in these years, private consumption accounts for 65% of GDP. And net exports, are just kind of a bit of frosting at the top of the cake that gets up to 5, 6, 7% GDP, which is enough to have 2-3% of growth, which looks good for an already large developed economy, but it was always going to be a fragile strategy. And so now we get to basically the present day, right? Because Germany had been relying on Chinese buyers for the goods they make, like cars and machinery and chemical production, for a long time. But now China, one, is looking like a warlike adversary in the world on the geopolitical stage. And Germany, like the rest of the West, doesn't want to fund their development anymore. So Germany is taking it upon themselves to withdraw. But besides that, China's also become a competitor in the biggest German industries. We've talked about how China is leading the world by far in EV production. Well, EVs are in fashion. German cars, yeah, they're still going to be able to export them, but the demand for German internal combustion engine cars is not going to be growing in the future at all. Machinery, China competes on machinery. Chemicals, China competes on chemicals. And part of that reason is actually because they made joint ventures with German companies who wanted to access Chinese markets.
They sold their own death warrant.
Exactly. They totally sold their own death warrant, and now it's coming back to bite them, not only because they're trying to decouple from China, but also because producers are going to be looking to China as the new place to set up their plants because of what's now happened with Germany's relationship with Russia.
Yes.
Because Germany made another bet that ended up going badly with another warlike economy where they've been benefiting from cheap Russian gas for 20, 30 years since the end of the Cold War. Now that gas is gone and Germans' energy prices have skyrocketed. Obviously that gas is gone because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in its attempt to do the good thing, which we can absolutely applaud them for in not funding the Russian war effort, Germany has been buying most of its gas and oil from the US, which it needs to get on tankers that come all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, meaning energy prices have skyrocketed.
Exactly. And imports from the Russian Federation are down 90% year over year. Exports to the Russian Federation are down 40% year over year. Which
does warm my heart. Like, that is Germany doing the right thing, but God, is it difficult for its economy.
Yeah.
Right? So German energy prices go up and inflation spikes in the country. But more worrisome is these massive German companies look to move elsewhere because they have some specifically energy intensive industries like chemicals production. So one of the major chemical companies in Germany is called BASF, or at least it was in Germany, because it recently has moved its headquarters to China because it needed to create it, because it had a joint venture there. They're not as worried about energy prices in China, and they're going to be centering their operations and production in China from now on.
See, this is just, and then this goes on the other thing, Germany's decision to get rid of nuclear power.
Yep.
Germany's decision of the Green Party there pushing out the nuclear power in favor of, solar and wind, when nuclear power has made France a very, very energy stable country.
Exactly.
Just totally signs your own death warrant.
Yep. Crippled them. Just the wrong move.
Terrible crippling move.
Yeah. And so BASF is just one example. There was a survey recently where the percentage of companies saying they want to leave the country doubled over the past year, from 16 to 32% of companies. Okay, so that's China, Russia. The country that Germany now exports the most to, since it's decoupling from China, is the U.S. The biggest categories of export goods that Germany sends to the U.S. are vehicles and machinery, which total $66 billion, or 40% of all exports to the U.S. But the Inflation Reduction Act incentivizes an American-based supply chain for those very types of goods, for EVs and for the machinery that's going to go into EVs. So you're looking at an increasingly protectionist global environment that's not going to be as welcoming to German goods. I would argue that the US should be more welcoming. Again, Germany is a close ally of ours, and I think we should keep them closer. But the way the world is going is they don't want to be reliant on exports nearly as much. So this is another area where you're going to see less demand and a much lower chance of growth in exports to the US.
Definitely.
So the other thing I want to talk about is labor. We talked about how wages have been suppressed. There was a bit of a spike in consumption in 2015 and 2016 because they did implement some policies, some social safety net policies, including a state-sponsored pension program and a minimum wage for the country. I think we're going to see a similar bump for labor. I think we're seeing consumption in the very short term is worrisome because it's been eaten into by inflation, because the demographic picture is terrible, one of the worst in the world. The majority of Germany's population is aging out of the labor force and thus are becoming, they're not as big of consumers. Mm-hmm. But I do think the labor movement, like is hitting the U.S. currently, is going to be hitting Germany in the coming year or two, which is going to decrease economic inequality, which should spur private consumption.
So this past year, we saw wage growth of around 0.6%. So year over year, their wages are outpacing inflation, but their real disposable income that they have in inflation-adjusted dollars is still barely above what it was in the pre-pandemic world. Yeah. So there's really basically seen no growth at all for the last 4 or 5 years now.
Yeah, which is brutal. And Germany this is an interesting conversation because Germany is a really high tax country. Its average tax rate for a citizen is 37% versus the OECD, which is a group of other rich countries, which has an average of 25%. So I think the German high taxation, I think cutting taxes for lower income people, middle income people, would be something that's actually really powerful for the German economy.
But wait, wouldn't that mean you have to take on debt?
It would mean you have to take on debt.
Yeah.
And I think that is a huge part of the answer for Germany. So this brings us, let's get to the current day. What spurred this deep dive and what has happened recently in Germany, what we talked about last week on the show, is a court ruling said that $60 billion or 60 billion euros, about $65 billion of government funding that were earmarked for the pandemic could not be used in 2024. So the ruling coalition has agreed on a new budget for 2024. And it doesn't suspend the debt brake, which means it leaves that $60 billion gap, more or less, in the budget. This means reducing the climate and transformation fund of the country by $12 billion next year and by $45 billion through 2027. It means cutting EV subsidies that were supposed to last through 2024 to get the EV transition going, and instead they're going to be ending at the end of this year. And it cuts subsidies for solar. Now, Prime Minister Olaf Scholz has said that those solar subsidies are going to have to make it back into the budget somehow. We don't know how that is. We don't have an answer. It also cuts funding for railroad upgrades. And these infrastructure improvements are needed desperately right now when the country has just been cut off from Russian gas and oil, and that is what is driving its inflation. The infrastructure investment is precisely what it needs. And so they're trying to maintain their image of like this couth, formal accountant
Yes.
of Europe, right? That keeps all of the books balanced. And I think it's just the wrong decision.
They took the wrong lesson from the German miracle.
Yep.
And because they took the wrong lesson from the German miracle, they're trying to replicate what the German miracle was in their head, of Erhard being a balanced budget, fiscally conservative neoliberal. And the truth is, that's not what the German miracle was. That's not what made Germany have that 8% growth. And it's not what's going to make Germany have record-breaking growth in the future either.
No, listen. Germany, we just said debt is not good. We don't like high interest rates, but we have to start understanding that everything is a cost-benefit analysis. Germany can decide to agree on this budget and not suspend the debt brake, right? And then only have a deficit of 0.35% of GDP for the 2024 budget. But the cost of doing that and in not upgrading your solar and wind capacity faster, in not subsidizing EVs, the cost of spurring climate change faster by not making this transition is
more detrimental than any debt you could have.
Totally. And it's higher, and the high energy prices that they'll continue to incur are going to be more painful to the government in the long run. I just think this is so clearly the wrong decision. I looked into Germany's debt to GDP ratio.
It's very good.
It's 60%.
Which is so good.
Ours is 130%, 120%, somewhere between there.
I think it's like 122.
So just, and we're not dying
Yeah.
over here. We're the strongest economy in the world. And I think we have massive problems. And I think we do need to tax, especially the top end of our earners more, because something that's hurting our economy is our income inequality. And we need to implement programs to fix that. But it is so clear that Germany can skyrocket that debt to GDP ratio and be absolutely okay and help themselves by funding these important programs.
Germany needs their own Inflation Reduction Act. They need to fund their own industries. They need their own infrastructure bill. They need the German government to do two things right now. They need the German government needs to be a bank for infrastructure and climate investment. Just funnel those industries with money, and they need some type of consumer spending. They need to spur some type of consumer spending, whether it's through a middle class tax cut, whether it's through some stimulus checks, something to get consumers in the German economy spending on German goods.
Yeah, absolutely.